In this video, we're going to touch on how you might use the BitScoop API Toolbox to deal with various auth workflows that you're going to encounter out in the wild. In our other videos, we've been using a local sample data provider that didn't really bother authenticating any requests. There also wasn't any concept of a user on this data provider. So essentially what that means is that the data available on a given endpoint, like /post or /users, was the same no matter who was requesting it. But this isn't necessarily the case with real data providers that you might come across. Instead, often the data available on a given endpoint depends on the user of the system. So for instance, a list of my Spotify playlists is going to probably be different than yours would be. So as an application developer, your task becomes negotiating the auth process with these various data providers, obtaining keys, and then using those keys to make requests on behalf of a given user that is probably using one of your applications. If you've never gone through this process yourself yet, you're probably at least still somewhat familiar with it if you've ever signed into an app using something like Google or Facebook. Unfortunately, implementing these workflows can be a bit of a pain, as you might expect. But using the BitScoop API Toolbox, you can normalize the different auth workflows like OpenID, OAuth 1, and OAuth 2 to make your job as an application developer as easy as possible. So how does the BitScoop API Toolbox normalize these auth workflows? What we do is give you an object to work with called a connection, and these connections are tied to provider maps. A connection object loosely represents a user and contains information like authentication keys that can be then used to identify your app to a data provider. So in the example in this slide, essentially what we have is an app that we might have created on the domain example.com. We simply send a post request to the connection subcollection on the BitScoop API. So we've created a provider map for this particular provider. This gives us an object back that contains the ID of the connection and the URL that we should redirect our user to. So we redirect our user to that URL. So now they're on example.com, and they're given the opportunity to grant or deny permission to your application. Once they've done this, example.com would redirect them back to the URL that you specify when you create that app. So if you want everything to work right, what you do is you specify that redirect URL as auth.api.bitscoop.com/done/the ID of your provider map associated with that application. After the user hits that URL on the BitScoop Auth API, what happens is the connection that you originally created with that post request is completed, and the various keys that you're going to need are stored on that connection object. Finally, BitScoop redirects the user to the URL that you've defined on the provider map as the ultimate redirect URL. Okay, so that previous slide was probably a lot to take in at once, but what we've done here is create an example that will hopefully clarify that process, just so you can see everything in action. So what we've done already is created a provider map and an application, an OAuth 2 application on github.com. So you can see here this provider map points to api.github.com, and the auth type is OAuth 2. So before we open up this provider map and look at the source code, let's go and show you what it would take to set up an OAuth application on GitHub. So you can see here that various fields have been provisioned automatically by GitHub when you create the app. What you get is a client ID and a client secret, and you use these in the auth process to get keys for particular users. You can see that we've entered some information here. This is the information that's going to be visible on the screen when you redirect a user to github.com. So none of this stuff you really need to put in the provider map, but it lets your users know what they're granting or denying permission to. And then you can see down here the authorization callback URL that we mentioned before. We called it the auth API URL. You can see auth.api bitscoop.com/done, and then the ID of the provider map matches the ID of the provider map here. Okay, so if we open up this provider map and look at the source, this should look relatively familiar to you if you've been following along in our previous videos. So you can see we have very simple endpoints, and the operative differences here are the fact that we now have scopes on this endpoint, and we now have an auth block which defines the authentication negotiation process with GitHub. So the idea of scopes is just going to be the permissions that's required for a particular endpoint. So that's just specific to various authentication workflows. Remember, in the examples we had before, /posts and /users and other stuff like that didn't require any permissions, so we didn't need to ask for anything. But what this will do if you have multiple endpoints, say, and then various scopes on the different endpoints, when you create a connection and it requests permissions, it's going to crawl the scopes and amalgamate them from every endpoint and do that very simply for you, so you don't need to worry about that. So if we look at the auth block here, you can see that the type is OAuth2, like we just said before, and it has the redirect URL that we talked about before. So we're ultimately going to redirect to example.com here. And then it has the authorization URL, the access token, signature, auth key, and auth secret. The auth key and the auth secret are transposed from these values that are created when you create the app. And different data providers are going to call these different things you're going to come across. But roughly this translates to the auth key and then the auth secret to the auth secret here. And then you have these various authorization URL, access token, and signature parameter values that are going to depend on the data provider. So you're going to have to do a little bit of research there. And talking about all these different possibilities is a little out of scope for this example. So we're going to touch on those in some later videos, but just know that this is going to be different, these couple of values here, for every data provider. So let's go ahead and create a connection to this provider map and show you what we can do with it. So we'll pop over to our other screen here, and this is going to send that post request to that sub-collection connections right here, and that's the ID of our provider map. So if we send this out, you can see that we actually get the value of the connection, so the ID of the connection right here, and then the redirect URL that we should send it to. Keep in mind that a user wouldn't be making this request. You'd be making this request probably from within one of your apps. So essentially, a user might visit a page like /signup on your app, and then you'd make a post request to this URL here. You'd get back the connection ID, and then what you'd actually do is return a 302 response containing this redirect URL right here. So we're going to, since we don't have an application wrapped around this, we're going to go ahead and copy that out and just paste it in a tab over on the other screen, but it's essentially going to accomplish the same behavior. So we're going to go to raw mode here just so we can copy and paste this. And we're going to hop over to our other screen. I'm going to open a new tab and I'm going to paste this in. And what happens is it takes you to this screen, and you're probably familiar with these kind of screens if you sign into a lot of various applications. You can see that it's requesting the permissions for repositories, like we specified on the endpoint. And you can see that we have a chance, based on the user we're signed in with, to authorize this application. So we're going to do that. And what's going to happen is, it was probably too quick to see, but it redirected back to auth.api.bitscoop.com/the ID, and then finally redirected to this example.com right here, example.com right there, that matches, with the appended query parameter connection ID 243, so on and so forth. This should look familiar if you caught it over on the other screen. That's the ID that was passed back in that connection. So we append this to the URL that it redirects to, just so you have a chance to identify which connection is actually being completed on that landing URL there. So now that we have that connection completed, let's go ahead and request the endpoint that we defined in this particular provider map, so /repos. So if we do this and send that request, the only difference here between what we had in other examples and this is we've added an additional header that allows us to identify that particular connection. So this is just a variable reference to our environment. If we go up here, you can see that the connection ID that we created is saved in the environment. So X connection ID is that ID. We're going to send this out, and you can see going through the BitScoop API Toolbox, we have normalized that authentication, and we have a list of all repositories associated with that user who authenticated the application. If we look at the connections collection here, we can go ahead and see a list of all our connections. So I'll draw your attention here. We have an auth data access token. This is the access token that GitHub granted to us. So using the BitScoop API Toolbox, you can easily take your existing connections that you might have gotten before and upload them and still use them, or you can always take the connections that you use BitScoop for to create and always export them out. So we don't hide or obfuscate these values from you. So auth is a relatively complicated topic, and this example was somewhat scope limited. So what we're going to do is cover much more about authentication in a more advanced video series to help you out. If you'd like to see some examples of dealing with authentication for some popular data providers, We have some examples available for you in the GitHub repository that we've listed here. And of course, if you run into any trouble doing any of these examples, please feel free to shoot us an email and we'd be happy to help you out. Aside from that, thanks so much for joining us for this video, and we hope to see you again soon.